Yomi Bava 75b. And we're at, hold on. Okay, we're a couple lines down, about 10 lines down. Brisa de Tanya. And I guess we'll start by reviewing. Okay, so yesterday we saw three opinions about moed b'knas v'achar ba'oedim. Okay, what does that mean? Somebody admits to a crime that incurs a penalty, and following his admission, witnesses come and testify that he committed the crime. So we learned already that moed b'knas, if you admit to a penalty, you don't pay the penalty. What is that sort of a temporary exception, or is that a permanent exemption? Are you exempt if you admit? Or do we say that no, admitting is only a temporary exception. For the time being, we can't force you to pay because we can't give a penalty that our only evidence is what the victim said, what the aggressor says. Okay, and this debate was, the question was, if witnesses come afterwards and say and testify that there were two witnesses come and say that he committed a crime, are you still exempt or not? And then we saw this adaptation of the permanent exemption opinion, which was as follows. In other words, one opinion says that if you admit to something, you're permanently exempt; you'll never pay it. However, there was a third opinion that modifies this opinion, and they say, true, but what constitutes an admission, a confession? Only confession that has consequences. As follows: if you admit that you stole something, there's a consequence; you need to pay back. And therefore, if later on witnesses come and testify that you stole, we still will say that you are permanently exempt from a double payment, kefil, or dollar v'hei for that matter. However, there are some types of admissions, of confessions that don't carry a consequence. For example, let's say there's witnesses that testify that somebody stole. And he says, you're right, I did steal, and I also slaughtered or sold it. It was a sheep or an ox. In that case, what's the consequence to his admission? Nothing. All his admission is to save him from the penalty. If you steal something, you have to give it back. That's true whether the item is still whole or whether the item was slaughtered. Same thing. You still have to make restitution in the amount that was stolen. In this case, you'd actually have to pay kefil either way. Whether you slaughter it or not, if you're a ganav and his witness is testifying that he's a ganav, then he has to pay back twice. His admission to bavakamma makes no difference. Similarly, the guy quote unquote admits, he confesses that he knocked out his slave's tooth. So he's trying to exempt himself from the penalty of having to release his indentured servant, having to free them, emancipate them. So therefore, okay, now let's say he admits. What's the consequence? Nothing. The only consequence is what he's trying to do is just to save himself from having to emancipate the slave. And therefore, that does not constitute an admission. Okay, this is all what we discussed yesterday. We said there was a Mishnah and a Brisa. We brought a proof from our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, the emphasis of our Mishnah emphasizes that if witnesses come afterwards, then he would have to pay a penalty. And the Mishnah explains that specifically refers to tabach u'machar, slaughter or sold, because tabach u'machar, there is no admission. The confession carries no consequence. And therefore, because the admission carries no consequence, therefore the admission does not permanently exempt you, and when witnesses come, you would be liable. That in a nutshell was the mission also we saw yesterday. Now we get to Brisa. You have a Brisa that supports this opinion. The Tanya we learned, Raw Adam Shemash Mishinabon. We saw this Brisa yesterday. He sees witnesses that are coming to court, right? He runs into court and he says, Ganafti, he says, I'm the thief. But I did not slaughter it, nor did I sell it. He pays only Karen. This is interesting. He denies slaughtering and selling, and he actually did, although he admits to the robbery. So the Gemara asks, we're in the first wide line. A5b. Now, second wide line. The potter. 1 second. Ganafti the Chayavatz and the Karen who the potter. Amar lo ganafti v'oedim shiganav chazam tevach mecharti v'oedim shidavach mechart lo Chayavatz and the Karen Chayav. Amar dad tficha lave dohi. Okay, as follows. Basically, the Brisa says he admits that it was stolen. He doesn't admit that it was slaughtered or sold. Mar asks, why can't the Brisa be referring to a scenario where he admits either to the stealing or to the fact that it was slaughtered or sold? Slaughtered or sold. Why does it have to be? Why does it have to be that he admits only to the robbery and not to the fact that it's slaughtered or sold? Why can't it be either or? Either it was sold, either he admits to stealing it, or there are witnesses that testify he stole it, but he admits to being slaughtered or sold. And the answer is very simple. According to what we explained, it makes a lot of sense. Because if you admit to you admit to the stolen item being slaughtered or sold, and then the witnesses that you see about to come to court actually do come to court and they testify, so then you're actually exempt. Your exemption is only temporary. As soon as the witnesses come, you would have to pay. And the reason is because the confession of slaughter is not a confession because it carries no consequence. That's why the Brisa must give an indication that we're referring to Geneva, to stealing. Why? Because Geneva carries a consequence. You have to pay the principal. But on the other hand, if you quote unquote admit, which is not really much of an admission, that it was slaughtered or stolen, there's no consequence to that admission. Therefore, if the witnesses come to court afterwards and find you guilty, you will have to pay, and your admission does not exempt you from anything. Okay. One second. Okay, Amri. So the Gemara says not necessarily not necessarily the case. This is not a good proof. Why? This itself is the Chiddush. In other words, the point of this price is the kivan to Amar Ganafti, since he admits to it being stolen. Alfagad to Amar Lo Tevachti V'Lo Macharti Ubo Edim Shtavach Umachar Potter. In other words, in this case, he lied about the item being stolen. Yet he's still exempt from Dalad V'Hei. Why? The reason is okay, basically over here, it's true that he admits to exempt himself from the kefil, but he does not admit to exempt himself from the Dalad V'Hei. So the Gemara is proposing maybe he should actually be liable for slaughter or selling. In other words, it's true he admits to the robbery. Okay, fine. So he's a robber. Now that we know he's a robber, he should have to pay Dalad V'Hei because he lied about it being. He said it was not slaughtered, and the witnesses said it was slaughtered. So if the witnesses are saying that it was slaughtered, he's lying, and everyone agrees the animal was stolen. You should have to pay Dalad V'Hei. Says the Brisa, no, there's no Dalad V'Hei. Why not? Because Dalet V'Hei adds on to Keren and Kefil. A regular thief pays Keren, then he pays Kefil, double payment. Dalet V'Hei adds on to Keren and Kefil. Once you're exempt from Kefil, you're exempt from Dalet V'Hei as well. So the Torah says you have to pay 4 or 5, not 3 or 4. Meaning if you subtract Kefil, that single payment, then it's actually 3 sheep or 4 oxen. The Torah doesn't say 3 or 4, the Torah says 4 or 5. Meaning you only pay Dalet V'Hei when you pay Kefil. And that's the chiddush of the brisa. Therefore, it has nothing to do with the question of whether the admission must have a consequence for there to be a permanent exemption from paying a penalty. If we're not together, please let me know. Okay, let's continue. This debate on this question, whether confession must have a consequence. Let's say it's this machlokes tanam. Two people testify that they saw a robbery, and 2 people testified that two others testify it was he slaughtered the animal or sold it. Who's mu'ed gneva? If the testimony on the robbery was huzam, it was falsified, the entire testimony goes out the window. There's no robbery, there can't be a slaughter or selling. If the witnesses of the slaughter were falsified, so the robber pays kefil because he stole, and the witnesses that testified, and they pay 3 and 4 because they only wanted to add on an additional 2 or 3. Okay. In other words, because the penalty for false witnesses is exactly what they wanted to do. The robber would have had to pay 4 or 5. Now, the first part of the testimony is true, so he pays 2, meaning he pays 1 for the principal, 2 for robbery. Otherwise, he would have had to pay an additional 3, 4, and maybe 5 if it was an X. Now, because the second set of witnesses wanted to give him an additional 2 or 3 animals, they have to pay that additional 2 or 3 animals. They have to pay 2 for the robbery, and he has to pay 3 times, and twice for a sheep. Okay, now Sukkot's opinion is a little bit odd here. Obviously, it's not the same scenario as the previous Gemara. Again, Simcha says that the first scenario was where 2 witnesses. One says robber, one says slaughter. The witnesses that say robber make the robber pay kefil. The witnesses that say slaughter make him pay an additional 3 oxen. Now you falsify the witnesses of robber, then he doesn't pay anything because there's no robbery, there's no slaughter. Can't slaughter unless he stole it. If the witnesses that say slaughter were falsified, they wanted to make him pay an additional 3 oxen. They pay 3 oxen. The robber pays keren and kefil. Sumchas here has this interesting scenario. He says that the witnesses pay twice, the robber pays 3 times, which seems to be odd. Let's examine this. A haikai. What exactly is he referring to? 1 second. If he's going on the first scenario where we falsified the testimony of that there was a robbery. So the Gemara says, the not agree that if you don't know there's a robbery, there's no way to know that the animal slaughtered was a stolen animal. The Ela Seif, it must be going in the second scenario. They falsify the testimony of the not of the robbers, but of the witnesses. I'm sorry, of the witnesses of slaughter, the slaughtering witnesses. So the Gemara says, then the rabbis seem to be correct here. The first witnesses were correct; they were not lying. So the robber has to pay twice, keren and kefil. And the second set of witnesses, the witnesses that witnesses slaughter, they have to pay 3 if it was oxen, 2 if there were sheep. Okay, so Gemara says, Okay, so it must be there's actually a third scenario that we're referring to in this price. The price doesn't exactly enumerate or specify. Going, what's the scenario? The Osve Trey Amrile Ganafta. Two witnesses come and say there was a robbery. Amar Lahu, so the robber says in Ganafta, you're right. And I slaughtered or sold it. So he admits to the robber. Two witnesses come and testify robbery. He says, you're right. And also, Tficha Mechira. However, he adds a catch. He says to the first witnesses, he says, you're right, I stole, but you weren't there to witness it. You're obviously lying. And now he admits that he did not steal in front of. He finds witness to falsify the first witnesses. As the first witnesses say you stole, and he says you're right, I stole, but you weren't there to watch it. You're obviously lying. And he finds people that can testify that they're lying. So he's massing the first set of witnesses. Okay, so what happens is that the original owner of the animal finds a different set of witnesses that actually did see the robbery. And they testify that he stole and he slaughtered or sold it. And the debate here is with regard to the admission of slaughter. The Rabbanat Savri Alfagab Dados Gneva Machmas Edem Hudi Kamayda Hadad Tficha Hadahi. Upotter Simchat Savra Kim the Dod Gneva Machmas Edem Hudi Kamayda Tficha Hadad Tficha La Hadahi. Hanach Edem Kamayda as Menu Mishaman. Okay. Okay, so now, 1 second. Let me just go through this slowly again. Hold on. Okay, so the rabbi says as follows. Now, what's the payment here? Obviously, the guy has to pay. The first set of witnesses wanted to make him pay Karen and Kefil. They need to pay twice to the robber because they were lying about the robber. The robber also needs to pay, for sure, Karen, because he admits to having it stolen. And now the question is his admission of slaughter an admission or not? The rabbis say, okay, 1 second. Even though the admission of robbery is because of witnesses, so the rabbis say that the admission of slaughter was not because of witnesses, because the first set of witnesses did not know that he slaughtered it, and therefore, 1 second. Because the admission is a valid admission, he's permanently exempt from paying dollar v'hei. And therefore, the witnesses that testified he slaughtered or sold it are also exempt. 1 second. I'm sorry. No. So again, the first witnesses are liable for Karen and Kefil. He, on the other hand, is not liable for dollar v'hei because he admitted to it. Even though there's no consequence to his confession, it still constitutes a valid admission, and it makes him permanently exempt for dollar v'hei. Okay, Sumcha holds, Sumcha says, since the admission of robbery is because of the witnesses, the tficha lav hada, 1 second. The admission of slaughter is not considered an admission either. 1 second. Okay, 1 second. Okay. Simcha holds, keeping the dodi gneva machmas edem who commanded the tficha lav hadol. Simcha says, since he's admitting to the robbery only because of the witnesses, that doesn't constitute a hadol. and therefore his admission of slaughter doesn't either constitute an admission. Neither admission is valid. Okay, the first set of witnesses owe two payments to the robber. The first set of witnesses owe two payments to the robber because they wanted to make him pay twice. The robber's admission is not valid because it came after testimony, and therefore, because none of his admissions are valid, therefore he would have to pay kafel as well to the robber, because ultimately speaking, to the owner, because ultimately speaking, there are witnesses, and he also has to pay dalad b'hay, because his admission to slaughter is not an admission. Why? Because there's no consequence. Therefore, he has to pay three oxen and two. So he also has to pay kafel, but he gets the keren and the kafel from the first set of witnesses. They have to pay him keren and kafel, and he has to pay. We'll see if they have to pay keren and kafel or just kafel. We'll get to that in a moment. They have to pay twice to him. They have to pay kafel to him. That's for sure. And he has to pay dalad b'hay, which includes the money that was given to him by the first set of witnesses. Okay, it goes about 10 lines from the bottom of the page. The first word line is derav. So Raka says the name of Ravika, the Kula Alma. Okay, so now we're clearly indicating that the brisa here, this debate between the rabbis and Sumches is about this question: does a confession without a consequence constitute a permanent exemption? Gemara says, Ravaka says the name of Ravika, not necessarily. Everyone could agree that the admission to slaughter does not constitute an admission because there was no consequence. Over here is another problem, which is called Edus Shetiyachal Azimas. Let's explain what is Edus Shetiyachal Azima. Basically, the key point here is that in order for witnesses who are falsified, they get the exact penalty they wanted to inflict on somebody else. Now, this is only the case where they can argue that we can only accept their testimony if we can be certain that they would get the same penalty they're trying to give. So, for example, let's say they argue that a murderer killed somebody who was terminally ill and was going to die in 3 days, and he was murdered. Not question. He was murdered with a gunshot wound. No question of that. And now it turns out the whole thing was a lie. So the witnesses can argue, look, we never wanted to. 1 second. What's the scenario here? 1 second. We were never arguing that the murderer should be killed, because if you look at the murderer, it's not fair to kill him, since he killed somebody that otherwise. I'm sorry, no, I have a scenario. I'm sorry. 1 second. Let me just get this case right. Hold on a second. It's the opposite scenario. The opposite. I'm sorry. Redo the scenario. Okay. Again, my mistake. The scenario is as follows: the opposite case, where one of the witnesses is terminally ill. He has a week left to live, and he testifies that Reuven killed somebody. So this constitutes an edus sheyat yachal. Why? Because let's say you falsify the witnesses. The guy who has 2 days left to live is basically dead anyway. He has very little incentive not to lie, because what are you going to kill him? He's about to die, and therefore we don't accept the testimony because we cannot inflict the same damage to the witnesses that they attempted to do to the murderer. They wanted to kill young healthy Reuven, and one of the witnesses themselves, or maybe both, are basically dead anyway. They're terminally ill and about to die in a day or 2 days. And therefore, this is considered an edus sheyat yachal azima. If you falsify the testimony, you cannot give a penalty to the witnesses. Okay, now this somehow relates to our Gemara. So let's see. Also Sahadi, Witnesses came, but Amri Leah, they say Ganafta. They testify that the robber stole. But Amr Lahu Ganafti Macharti. I'm sorry, Ganafti Tavachti Macharti. Mi Ulevefnechem Ganafti. I'll say plenty. He says, you're right. He says, I did steal it, and I also slaughtered and sold it, but not in front of you, in front of different people. So this is, let's say, Reuven and Shimon come to court. They testify that Levi stole Zvulun's sheep, and Levi says, you're right, I did steal Zvulun's sheep, but you weren't there. Only Yosef and Binyamin. Okay, so what do you think? Zvulun, of course, went to Yosef and Binyamin, and he says, okay, and he found them. Now, Levi, the robber, he finds witnesses that falsify Reuven and Shimon's testimony, because clearly Reuven, he's pretty certain that Reuven and Shimon are lying, that they did not see him stealing. But also plenty. And Zvulun, sure enough, brings in Yosef and Binyamin. And Yosef and Binyamin testify that he stole and he slaughtered it or sold it. This is the debate. One second. Okay. The rabbis say that the testimony of Yosef and Binyamin is now Eidus Shiat Yochel Azima. Why? Reuven and Yosef and Binyamin are testifying that that Levi stole a sheep from Zvulun. Levi admits to stealing a sheep from Zvulun. And in fact, the witnesses are testifying exactly what the guilty party says. This is considered an unfalsifiable testimony, because even if the witnesses are lying, clearly the oppressor is clearly admitting that he committed a certain crime. And this is considered unfalsifiable. It's a bit of a variation from the classical example, which is what I told you before, but it's sufficient enough to make the point that you cannot rely on the testimony of Yosef and Binyamin, because effectively the aggressor, Levi, has validated everything they said by admitting to it. And Simchas agrees that Simchas says the testimony is valid despite the fact that they cannot be falsified. The Gemara says, what do you mean? That isn't the general rule that we do not accept such testimony? The Gemara says, no. So Simcha says, no, there's a difference here. The general Eidus Yet Yochel Azima is a testimony that cannot be falsified. For example, somebody testifies that Reuven stole Shimon's cow. They say, when did he steal Shimon's cow? I'm not sure. What time of day? Don't know. Now, the problem is that if the method of falsification is to argue that the witnesses were in a different place at that time, and they don't know the time, it's impossible to testify that they were in a different place. They have to give at least some sort of time frame. That, he says, is called Eidus Shit Yochel Azima. You can't falsify them because they're not making statements that are falsifiable. Inherently, their testimony is unfalsifiable. Since the definition of falsifiable testimony is by claiming that you're in a different place at that time. However, over here, the fact that the aggressor admits to committing a crime does not constitute a Eidus Shit Yochel Azima. It doesn't constitute the fact that these witnesses are not falsifiable. They could still be falsified, even if the victim admits to doing exactly what the witnesses said he did. Okay. Ayin Hey, this next Gemara, 75b. I'm sorry, this is actually just wrapping up previous Gemara. Amar, this is a side point. Hein Misham, and second to bottom line. Hein Misham Tashlum Kefel, Midikam the God of Karen by Shlomi. Okay. In other words, the first set of witnesses in this scenario we said before. In other words, going back, two witnesses say the guy stole. The guy says, you're right, but you're a lawyer. Other people saw me steal. And they bring in Edi Azama and their mounts and they falsify them. But then other witnesses, the two witnesses that he identified, they come in and say, you stole. Ultimately speaking, this guy is a robber. He admits to being a robber. So why did the first two witnesses that said he was a robber, why did they pay two payments? They should only pay one payment because everyone agrees he's a thief. What they said about the thievery wasn't untrue. The Ganav should have to pay care of the principal, and they should have to pay only the kefil. The Gemara admits basically, yeah, they only pay the penalty of the double penalty, but nothing else. Okay. Okay. We're top of Ayin Vav Aleph, 76a. Okay, so what happened? He going back to the Mishnah, he stole an animal, then he sanctified the animal. How did he do that? So we're talking here after Yush and Shini Rishus. Yush means the owner gave up from finding it. Shini Rishus means that he basically. 1 second, hold on. Okay, Eric, you can put that in the chat. Anyone who wants to respond to figure it out. Okay, again, the Mishnah says that he stole an animal. The owner gives up on finding it. So that's Yush, and we're going to go now with Yush Kadi Loy Kani, meaning Yush. Okay, Yush means the owner sort of partially removes himself, still owns it, but then the robber sanctifies the animal. He says this animal is hektish. Now, give me a second here. Okay, now because a combination of making the animal hektish together with changing the domain, that turns the animal into hektish. So it's belonging by hektish. Then he slaughters or sells it. He's not slaughtering or selling the owner's animal. At that point, it belongs to hektish, and therefore he's exempt. Now, there's a technical problem here. You're wondering to yourself, you're probably thinking this question. Hold on a second. He steals an animal, so he could sell it to me or you, or he could sell it to hektish. Why don't we consider sanctifying an animal a form of sale? That itself should be the tovach machar, not tovach, not the slaughter, but it should be the machar, the sale. So it's selling an animal and making it hektish, donating it to the temple should be the sale. So Gemara says, top of 76a. I understand that the slaughtering the animals does not belong to the owner; it belongs to hektish. Fine, that makes sense. And it does not belong to the owner. However, 1 second. Why don't we consider the donation to hektish as if it were a sale to a private individual? Who cares if you sold it to a private person or you sold it to God? In fact, by donating it to hektish. The Gemara says, okay, so Rav Shimon has an interesting proposal. Basically, Rav Shimon argues that this is the concept called davar hagorim l'mammon k'mammon tamid. Something that causes money is like money. What does that mean? Let's say the robber says, maybe a year ago, he said, I feel so indebted to God. I want to, I accept on myself. The robber says that he accepts on himself to bring a sacrifice. Now, in this case, because the robber accepted on himself, so he has to bring the sacrifice no matter come what may to any designated animal. Now he designates his stolen animal. I know that's a little bit odd. He designates the stolen animal as the sacrifice. Hold on a second. If he loses that animal gets taken away by the police. What happens? He has to bring a new one. In effect, because this animal can cause him a financial loss, it's as if it's his animal, the robber's animal. So therefore, it's not directly a sale to hektish because it remains in the robber's domain. The problem is, of course, the end of the Mishnah specifies Rav Shimon. Clearly, Rav Shimon disagrees with the first part of the Mishnah, which means that clearly the first part of the Mishnah is not Rav Shimon. This answer is not going to work. The Gemara explains. Hamid is safe for Rav Shimon. Rav Shimon Hava, Rachel Rav Shimon. Because the conclusion of the brisa is Rav Shimon, it must be the first part. because the conclusion of the Mishnah is Reb Shimon, it must be the first part of the Mishnah is not Reb Shimon. So we can't force the Mishnah, pigeonhole the Mishnah into Reb Shimon's opinion. So you have to give it a different resolution. Okay, very simple. There's two types of sacrifices: kachim kalim. I'm not going to go into the technical differences. Let's just say, without specifying the general rule, an oila, for example, is an example of kachim. So is the chapas and nasham. An oila is a sacrifice that's entirely burnt. A shlomim, which is a sacrifice that's partially burnt, partially given to the kahana, and partially eaten. That type of sacrifice is considered kachim kalim. It's eaten even outside the temple. It's eaten anywhere in Jerusalem. Okay. And therefore, kachim kalim, according to basic legally, remains the ownership of the one who sanctified it. Therefore, it's owned by the robber, not by hektish. And therefore, it's not considered a sale. So Gemara says, hold on. You mean to say that if he sanctified an oil sacrifice, then you would pay 4 and 5. If that's the case, the first part of the Mishnah that says that if you stole, slaughtered, and then sanctified the slaughtered animal, you pay 4 and 5. We have more scenarios. We can give another example. Not only if you stole, slaughtered, sanctified, we could even have stole, sanctified ayla, and then and that also is considered a sale. That is the machar. In other words, by kachim kalim, by animals that are not sanctified for that are still owned by the original owner who sanctified them, then it would have to be stole, slaughtered, sanctified. However, by kachim, by sanctified animals, but by animals that are in the kachim category, it could be stole, sanctified ayla. That's considered a sale to hektish. And you'll ask me, 1 second. I'm sorry. Okay, so Gemara resolves. It must be that there's no difference between completely sanctified or kachim kalim, where it was doesn't make a difference whether the animal is sanctified such that it's completely in the domain of hektish or such that it's in the domain of the robber. Yisrael, you talk in the other room. You go to the dining room and play in the dining room. Besides, he's giving a shiur. Okay? And try to be quiet, okay? Okay, udikashalach, and you'll ask me, mali makar lahedit, mali makar l'shamayim. What's the difference if you sell to a hedyet, or what's the difference if you sell to a private individual, or you sell it to the temple fund as a sacrifice? The answer is very simple. Makar lahedit mikar to the Reuven v'hasha to the Shimon. If you sell to a private individual, originally it was mine, now it's yours. If you sanctify an animal, originally it was the animal of, let's say I sanctify my animal. It originally was my animal, and then it still is my animal. It's not considered to have changed domains, and therefore it's in a sale sanctifying an animal as a sacrifice is not considered a sale because it's not considered. People don't consider it as a change of domain. Okay. That's 74. Okay, we'll continue. It looks like Eric pointed out the check was canceled. Is that right? I can't figure it out. Okay, we'll figure it out. It looks like there's probably no. I don't think there's going to be a minyan shachos today. Yeah, I see. It is. I walked outside this morning. It is absolutely treacherous. It's absolutely treacherous.
Only way to get there would be on ice skates.
Yeah, I tried putting on chains. I was slipping and I couldn't even get my chains on.
Yeah. It's like oil on top of the ice.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so we'll continue. Maybe I'll go. Maybe I'll go. Tomorrow's a shorter daf anyway, so maybe I'll go 2-3 minutes over time. I don't know if we'll start tomorrow. We won't go too far over time. Okay. Rav Shimon says. Okay. Now let's go back. Rav Shimon in the Mishnah has an interesting distinction, which is not entirely clear. Rav Shimon says that if if you're like we explained before, when you sanctify an animal, there are two ways to do it. One is you can say a person could say that his animal harezu ayla. This animal should be an ayla. This animal means that if the animal is missing, or if the animal dies suddenly, he's exempt from bringing it. If, however, the responsibility is on himself, he's obligated to bring it. So Reb Shimon says if the responsibility is on himself, then he pays dalad v'hei. If the responsibility is not on himself, he does not pay dalad v'hei. So let's go through this. Amri, let's explain. While it's true that Reb Shimon, 1 second. Okay, the Gemara proposes that the explanation of Reb Shimon is that sanctifying an animal is like selling it to Hektish. It's like selling it to the temple fund. If that's the case, then hold on a second. Then if the robber sells it to the temple fund, it should be the opposite. If he says this sacrifice should be this animal should be a sacrifice, that is a complete sale to. It's a sale as a sacrifice. You're selling it to be a sacrifice. If, however, he says I accept that myself, then Reb Shimon says that's a davar daram l'mavan. It still belongs to the robber, and if it still belongs to the robber, there should not be dalad v'hei. This is the opposite of Reb Shimon. Again, Reb Shimon says if you accept responsibility, then it's still yours. If you bring it as a sacrifice but don't accept responsibility, then it's completely the temple funds. Okay, if it's completely the temple funds, that's the reason why you should pay 4 and 5, because you sold it to the temple by bringing it as a sacrifice and not accepting responsibility. But Reb Shimon says actually that scenario you're exempt from dalad v'hei. And the opposite scenario where you did accept responsibility, Reb Shimon says it's still yours. If it's still mine, meaning if it's still the robber's, and the robber accepted responsibility, then it's not the temple funds because it's still his. He has responsibility. Therefore, he should not be paying 4 and 5. But Reb Shimon says he does pay 4 and 5. What's going on? If you accept the responsibility, meaning that the animal suddenly dies, you must replenish it, then because you still haven't taken it out of your domain. 1 second. Gemara says, Amri, try to be quiet, okay? Reb Shimon is referring to something else. Okay, most of Reb Shimon's talking about something else. This is what we're referring to. Okay, somebody who steals from a robber doesn't pay 4 and 5, but this is the main important point. If somebody steals a sacrifice, the owner has already sacrificed the animal, and the robber steals a sacrifice, the robber is exempt from dalad v'hei. My time, what's the reason? The guna of mibesa ish, v'lo mibesa hektish. You have to steal from a person's house, not from the house of hektish. You can't steal sacrifice. Says Reb Shimon, I'm chayev. If you've stolen an animal that the owner was personally responsible for, so now it does actually belong to the owner, then chayev dalad v'hei. My time, But if the owner wasn't responsible to bring the sacrifice, potter, you're exempt. Like this is not stealing from a person because you stole a sacrificial animal. Okay, we'll just begin the next Gemara. Mechti, open question. Reb Shimon is of the opinion that a non-kosher slaughter does not make you lie. So when the Torah rule is ganav, you steal it, tavach, you slaughtered it. What does it mean to slaughter? It means to do a halachically appropriate shchita, where the animal is actually permitted by the shchita. We have one problem here, and I'm sure you're all thinking about this. This is shchutei chutz. What does that mean? You took a sacrifice and you slaughtered it outside the temple. That sacrifice is going to go to the dogs, or it will be entirely prohibited. Because if you slaughter a sacrifice outside of the temple, the animal becomes prohibited. Therefore, the slaughtering is not a valid slaughtering. So how could it be that you pay dalad v'hein? The Gemara offers a few proposals. Rav Dimi says in the name of Rabbi Yehudah, very simple, he actually brought it as a sacrifice. So the robber brought the animal to the temple. He slaughtered it with the intention that the owner should have an atonement. Okay, now there's just one problem here. If the owner actually does have an atonement, then the owner accomplished the purpose of his sacrifice. So effectively, that's the same as giving back the animal to the owner, because the owner wanted this to be a sacrifice. You brought it as a sacrifice, and it was a valid sacrifice. The owner has fulfilled his obligation. He accepted responsibility to bring a personal sacrifice, and now the robber brought it for him with the intention that he should get it. Amazing. He gets the sacrifice. He gets the benefit of the sacrifice. He doesn't have to bring a new one, and that should be the same as actually having gotten back the animal. So Amar Yitzchak Ravin shenish b'chadam. So Yitzchak Ravin says no. The main atonement of a sacrifice is to pour the blood on the altar, and the blood spilled out, or maybe the robber intentionally spilled out the blood, and either way it doesn't make a difference. The animal did not atone for the owner, and therefore the robber has to give him a new animal, not only just a new animal, 4 and 5 new animals. Ravin says another possibility in the name of Rabbi Yehudah. He slaughtered the animal inside the temple, but did not do it with the intention of the owner, the original owner, the one who he stole from, and therefore doesn't atone for the original owner. And and effectively this is a slaughtering and selling, a selling and slaughtering, and he has to pay 4 and 5. Top of 76b. Okay, he slaughtered an animal with a blemish outside of the temple, which appears to be permitted. However, it's not so simple, of course, and this we will continue tomorrow. We'll continue with Ayin Vav, top of 76b. Ayin Zayin is pretty short, so we should be able to actually be a little bit ahead because Ayin Ches is a little long.